March 28, 1942. 0134 hours. The mouth of the Loire estuary, Saint-Nazaire, occupied France. A single destroyer, packed to bursting with explosives, unmoving at nearly full speed, under a curtain of German searchlights and tracer fire, drives her bow directly into the steel casing gate of the largest dry dock on the entire Atlantic coast of Europe. The impact stops her dead, her hull wedged and crumpled into the lock gate. She is just destroyed as a piece of navigable structure, though nothing about her appearance suggests she carries anything more dangerous than the 4-inch guns visible on her deck. Inside her bow, packed into steel tanks and set in concrete for exactly this outcome, sit 4.5 tons of Armator explosive, wired to time delay fuses set to detonate hours after this moment, hours after the ship has been boarded, inspected, and the raiders are counting on it, crawled over by curious German officers who have no idea what they are standing on. The ship is HMS Campbelltown, and 18 months earlier, she did not belong to the Royal Navy at all. She was USS Buchanan, a flush-decked American destroyer laid down during the last months of the First World War, a design so thoroughly obsolete by 1940 that the United States Navy considered 50 of her sister ships worth trading away entirely, in exchange for British bases, rather than keep them in active service. The Kriegsmarine garrison at Saint-Nazaire, waking that morning to the wreckage lodged in their dry dock gate, will spend the rest of the day certain the danger has passed. It has not. This is how a scrapped, second-hand American destroyer became the largest single demolition charge the Royal Navy ever detonated against a single target, and how it took Adolf Hitler's most dangerous battleship of the entire Atlantic theater without a single German round ever needing to be fired at her, directly to understand why a single dry dock gate on the French coast became worth an operation of this scale and this cost. It helps to step back to the broader naval situation Britain faced in the winter of 1941 and early 1942, a period in which the German surface fleet, though small in absolute numbers compared to the Royal Navy, still possessed the capacity to inflict genuinely disproportionate damage. Its heaviest units were ever allowed to operate freely against Atlantic convoy traffic. Germany had entered the war with only a handful of true capital ships, but each of them, Bismarck and her sister Tirpitz'S chief among them, represented a weapon whose raw destructive potential against unescorted or lightly escorted merchant shipping was almost impossible to overstate. A single battleship, properly handled and allowed to operate in open water against convoy routes that could not always be covered by heavy escorts of their own, could sink or scatter an entire convoy in an engagement lasting minutes, inflicting losses that months of successful U-boat hunting might not offset. The Royal Navy's entire strategic posture toward the German surface fleet through 1941 and 1942 was consequently built around a single overriding priority: containment. German capital ships needed to be found, tracked, and where possible destroyed the moment they attempted to break out into open Atlantic waters, because allowing even one of them extended freedom of movement risked a level of damage to Britain's seaborne supply lines that the country's ability to continue the war might not comfortably absorb. The pursuit and eventual destruction of Bismarck in May 1941 had demonstrated both the seriousness of this threat and the difficulty of countering it. Bismarck's sortie into the Atlantic in May 1941, in company with the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, had already resulted in the loss of HMS Hood, one of the most storied capital ships in the entire Royal Navy, sunk within minutes of first contact in the Denmark Strait, a shock that reverberated through the British public and the Admiralty alike, and that underlined, in the starkest possible terms, exactly what a single German capital ship, operating with skill and a measure of luck, could accomplish against even a well-armed opponent. Bismarck's own destruction days later, achieved only through a combination of aerial torpedo damage that crippled her steering and a subsequent pursuit by a substantial portion of the home fleet's available heavy units, had cost the Royal Navy an enormous commitment of ships, fuel, and operational risk to bring about, and it left British naval planners acutely aware that they could not necessarily count on repeating that outcome at that cost. Every time a German capital ship attempted a similar breakout in the future, it was in this context that Bismarck's original destination mattered so much to everything that followed. She had been heading not back to Germany, but toward Saint-Nazaire, specifically toward the Normandie Dock, the one facility on the entire French coast capable of taking a ship of her size for full repair. And had she reached it, even in a damaged condition, German naval engineers could have restored her to fighting readiness at a base far closer to the Atlantic convoy routes than any facility in Germany itself, allowing her, once repaired, to resume exactly the kind of commerce-raiding sortie that had already cost the Royal Navy so dearly. British naval intelligence drew the obvious conclusion from this near miss: as long as the Normandie Dock remained intact and operational, any future German capital ship damaged during an Atlantic sortie, whether Tirpitz'S or some as yet unbuilt successor, had a genuine, viable path to repair and re-engagement that did not require running the considerably more dangerous transit all the way back to a home port in Germany or occupied Norway, removing that option entirely by destroying the dock itself rather than simply hoping to catch and sink every German capital ship that might attempt to use it, offered a way to permanently reduce the strategic value of any future German Atlantic sortie, regardless of how that individual engagement at sea actually played out. Combined Operations Headquarters, established under Admiral Sir Roger Keyes and, from October 1941, under the more aggressive leadership of Lord Louis Mountbatten, had spent much of 1941 developing the doctrine and the specialized units, commando forces trained specifically for amphibious raiding, that would eventually make an attack on the Normandie Dock conceivable at all. Mountbatten's appointment in particular marked a deliberate shift in how Combined Operations approached its mission. Under Keyes, the organization had focused heavily on smaller scale raids intended primarily to harass German coastal defenses and maintain a sense of continued British offensive activity at a point in the war when Britain's ability to strike back against occupied Europe by any other means remained severely limited. Mountbatten, arriving with Churchill's explicit backing and a mandate to think in bolder, more strategically ambitious terms, pushed Combined Operations toward raids designed not merely to harass, but to achieve specific, measurable strategic effects, of which the plan against Saint-Nazaire's dry dock would become the most consequential example undertaken during his tenure. The raids planners understood from the outset that they were not designing an operation intended primarily to inflict casualties or capture prisoners in the conventional sense, but one built entirely around the destruction of a single, specific piece of industrial infrastructure whose loss would produce strategic consequences lasting 4 years rather than days. The dock itself, however, presented a target that conventional attack methods could not realistically hope to destroy. RAF Bomber Command had already demonstrated repeatedly, against similarly reinforced concrete targets elsewhere on the French coast, that high explosive bombs dropped from altitude, even in significant tonnage, routinely failed to penetrate structures built with the kind of reinforced concrete German engineers favored for exactly this category of installation. And Saint-Nazaire's dock gates, the caissons that sealed the dock chamber and controlled the water level within it, were massive steel and concrete structures specifically designed to withstand exactly the kind of battle damage a warship or an aerial bomb might inflict. Bomber Command sorties flown against Saint-Nazaire and similar reinforced targets along the French coast through 1941 had repeatedly returned photographic evidence of bombs landing squarely on or near these structures without producing anything close to the kind of catastrophic structural failure that would render the target permanently unusable, a pattern that convinced planners at both the Air Ministry and Combined Operations that aerial bombardment alone, however heavy, was simply the wrong tool for this particular job. A conventional naval bombardment, sailing surface ships close enough to the French coast to shell the dock directly would have meant running an entire task force past coastal artillery batteries, U-boat pens, and shore-based Luftwaffe cover in a stretch of water. The Germans had spent 2 years fortifying specifically against exactly this kind of attack, an operation that risked losing capital ships Britain could not spare in an attempt to destroy a single dry dock. A trade that made no strategic sense regardless of the outcome. St. Nazaire's harbour defences by early 1942 included multiple batteries of heavy coastal artillery, extensive flag positions capable of engaging surface targets directly as well as aircraft, and a garrison specifically tasked with defending what German planners understood to be a strategically valuable facility, all of which made any approach by a conventional naval task force an extraordinarily dangerous proposition regardless of how much firepower that task force might bring to the engagement. What combined operations needed was a way to deliver a demolition charge large enough to destroy the casing gate directly, at point-blank range, without exposing a valuable warship to the kind of sustained bombardment that approaching St. Nazaire's harbour defences under fire for any extended period would inevitably invite. The solution that emerged, credited principally to planners within combined operations working through the closing months of 1941, was audacious in a way that reflected both genuine tactical insight and a fairly stark acceptance of how expendable the delivery vehicle itself would need to be. Rather than attempting to bombard the casing gate from a distance, the plan called for driving an actual ship directly into it, at speed, using the ship's own mass and momentum to lodge her bow firmly into the gate structure, and then detonating a very large demolition charge built directly into that bow section, timed to explode hours after the ramming itself, once German personnel, drawn by curiosity and the novelty of an enemy warship suddenly sitting wrecked in their own dock, had gathered around and aboard the ship to inspect her, unaware that they were standing directly on top of several tons of high explosive. This basic concept, a delayed charge concealed inside an apparently disabled or captured vessel, drew on a long tradition of naval deception and delayed demolition that stretched back well before the Second World War. But the scale of the charge involved, and the specific tactical requirement that the delivery ship survive a heavily defended, run-in at speed before lodging herself precisely enough into a target structure to make the subsequent detonation maximally effective, represented something considerably more ambitious than anything combined operations had previously attempted. The ship chosen for this one-way mission aimed to satisfy several requirements simultaneously that, taken together, narrowed the field considerably. She needed sufficient displacement and hull strength to survive ramming a solid steel and concrete structure at speed without breaking apart or sinking before the charge could be positioned and detonated. She needed a shallow enough draft to navigate the sandbanks and shoal water of the Loire estuary approach, a stretch of water considered by conventional naval planners to be effectively unnavigable for a vessel of destroyer size except at specific states of the tide, and, given the near certainty that the ship herself would be destroyed or abandoned as a total loss regardless of the mission's outcome, she needed to be a vessel the Royal Navy could genuinely afford to expend entirely, rather than a modern warship whose loss would represent a meaningful reduction in Britain's available naval strength. HMS Campbelltown met every one of these requirements precisely because of, rather than despite, her age and her origins. She had been built as USS Buchanan, a Wicks-class flush-decked destroyer laid down in 1918. One of well over 250 nearly identical destroyers rushed into construction by American shipyards in the final year of the First World War, a design that, even by the standards of 1918, prioritized speed of construction and simplicity over any particular refinement, and that had been considered thoroughly obsolete by the United States Navy's own standards well before the outbreak of the Second World War. These flush-deck destroyers, sometimes referred to collectively as the four stackers or four pipers for their distinctive four funnels, had been built in such enormous numbers during the final push of American wartime shipbuilding that a substantial fraction of them spent much of the interwar period laid up in reserve fleets, considered surplus to the peacetime Navy's requirements almost as soon as the war that had prompted their construction ended. By the late 1930s, with newer, more capable destroyer designs entering American service, these aging vessels represented exactly the kind of obsolete tonnage a Navy modernizing its fleet could contemplate disposing of entirely without any meaningful reduction in genuine combat capability. In September 1940, as part of the Destroyers 4 Bases Agreement, 50 of these aging 4-stack destroyers, ships the American Navy judged worth trading away entirely rather than continuing to maintain in active service, were transferred to Britain in exchange for basing rights on British territory in the Western Hemisphere, a deal that reflected exactly how little continued military value the United States placed on this specific class of vessel. By 1940, the agreement itself, negotiated between Churchill and Roosevelt at a moment when Britain's need for additional escort vessels to counter the U-boat threat was acute and immediate, gave Britain 50 hulls of genuinely limited modern combat value in exchange for basing rights the United States judged, correctly, to be of considerably greater long-term strategic worth to American hemispheric defense. Buchanan, renamed Campbelltown upon entering Royal Navy service, spent her first year and a half under the White Ensign, performing the kind of unglamorous convoy escort duty that most of her 50 sister ships were assigned to, entirely undistinguished service that gave no early hint she would eventually be selected for what remains, by most historical assessments, the single most audacious commando raid of the entire war, when combined operations planners settled on the plan to ram a ship directly into the Normandie Dock's casing gate. Campbelltown's age and her origin as one of 50 essentially expendable second-hand American destroyers made her precisely the kind of vessel the Royal Navy could commit to a mission with essentially no realistic chance of the ship herself surviving intact, without weighing that loss against the strategic cost of losing a genuinely modern or valuable warship in the attempt. Before we get into the raid itself, if you're finding this deep dive into WW to History Trench interesting, subscribing takes a second and supports the channel. The physical modifications made to Campbelltown in the weeks before the raid reflected the specific, narrow purpose she had been selected for with unusual precision. Naval engineers stripped weight from the ship wherever possible to reduce her draft sufficiently to cross the Loire estuary's shallow approaches, removing torpedo tubes, most of her original armament, and other equipment no longer relevant to a one-way ramming mission, while simultaneously adding steel armor plating around her wheelhouse and forward gun positions, specifically to give her exposed crew some protection, the run-in under expected German fire. This weight-stripping exercise was carried out with considerable precision, since the entire viability of the raid depended on Campbelltown drawing shallow enough water to cross sandbanks that would otherwise have grounded her long before she ever reached the dock gate itself. And naval architects involved in the refit calculated exactly how much equipment could be removed and where armor plating could be safely added in its place, without compromising the delicate balance between protecting the crew during the approach and keeping the ship lit enough to actually complete the transit. 2 of her original 4 funnels were removed entirely, and the remaining 2 were cut down and angled in a deliberate attempt to alter her silhouette to resemble a German MQ-class torpedo boat closely enough, at least in poor visibility and at a distance, to buy the approaching force a few additional critical minutes before German coastal observers positively identified her as a hostile Royal Navy vessel rather than one of their own patrol craft returning to harbour. This disguise extended beyond the physical alteration of the ship's silhouette. The raiding force sailed under a German naval ensign for the bulk of the approach, and radio operators embedded with the flotilla had been supplied with captured German signal codebooks and recognition procedures, allowing the force to respond to challenges from shore-based German observers using correct, current naval signaling conventions, rather than an improvised or obviously foreign response that would have given the game away immediately. The deception was never expected to hold indefinitely, only long enough to get the force within striking distance before German gunners, however suspicious, could be certain enough of what they were looking at to open fire with full confidence. The genuinely decisive modification, however, was concealed entirely within her bow. Naval armament specialists packed 4.5 tons of Armator high explosive into specially constructed steel tanks positioned directly behind the point where the ship's stem would strike the casing gate, and then encased the entire charge in concrete, both to protect it from accidental detonation during the approach under fire and, just as critically, to ensure that once the ship rammed the gate and came to rest, the explosive charge sat as close as physically possible to the structure it needed to destroy, embedded in wreckage that German engineers, however thoroughly they searched the grounded hull in the hours afterward, would find extraordinarily difficult to locate and disarm, even as they suspected its presence at all. The choice of Armator as the explosive filler, rather than a more modern or more powerful alternative, reflected both its ready availability in the quantities the mission required and its known stability and reliability characteristics, qualities that mattered enormously given that the charge needed to survive not only the violence of the ramming impact itself, but potentially hours of subsequent handling, inspection, and vibration as German personnel moved around and over the wrecked hull before the delayed detonation finally occurred. The fuses themselves were pencil-type delay detonators, chemical time fuses selected specifically because they made no audible ticking and gave no external indication of the countdown running inside them, set for a delay in the region of 8 to 9 hours from the moment of ramming, timed deliberately to detonate not during the chaos of the raid itself, when German personnel would be alert, armed, and actively searching the wrecked ship for exactly this kind of danger, but well into the following morning, once the immediate crisis had apparently passed and curious German officers, engineers, and even some invited local dignitaries had gathered aboard the grounded hull to inspect the captured British destroyer at their leisure. This choice of fuse technology and the specific delay period selected represented a calculated gamble in its own right. To shorter delay risked the charge detonating before German search parties had finished their initial, most intensive inspection of the wreck, potentially while British personnel or prisoners were still in the immediate vicinity, while too long a delay risked giving German engineers enough time to eventually locate and successfully disarm the charge before it ever went off. The 8-hour window chosen reflected the planner's best estimate of exactly how long German curiosity and administrative process would take to bring the maximum number of personnel aboard the wreck, while still falling within a period the concrete encasement and Armator's known stability, it reasonable to expect the charge to survive undetected. Operation Chariot, as the raid was formally designated, sailed from Falmouth on the evening of March 26, 1942, a force built around Campbelltown herself, escorted by the motor gunboat MGB 314, carrying the raid's overall naval commander, Commander Robert Ryder, and the Commando Forces commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, along with 16 Fairmile motor launches, small, lightly armored wooden vessels each carrying a contingent of commandos assigned to specific demolition targets within the dock complex once Campbelltown had rammed the gate, and a single motor torpedo boat, MTB-74, held in reserve carrying additional torpedoes fitted with their own delay fuses, intended as a backup means of destroying the casing gate should Campbelltown herself fail to reach it. The presence of this backup torpedo boat reflected the planner's clear-eyed acknowledgement that Campbelltown might well be sunk or disabled before ever reaching her target, and that the raid's central objective, the destruction of the casing gate, needed at least one alternative means of accomplishment built into the plan rather than resting entirely on a single ship. Successfully completing an extraordinarily hazardous run under fire, the force sailed roughly 400 miles across open, water toward the French coast disguised, in a deliberate and carefully rehearsed deception, as a routine German anti-submarine patrol group, flying a German naval ensign and, in the crucial final approach up the Loire estuary itself, using captured German signal codebooks to respond to challenges from shore-based defenses in correct German naval procedure, a deception that brought the approaching force several critical minutes of confusion among German coastal observers who, even as searchlights swept across the small flotilla, initially hesitated to open fire on vessels, apparently identifying themselves correctly as friendly. The transit itself, conducted largely in darkness and requiring precise navigation across open water toward a specific, narrow estuary entrance, demanded a level of seamanship and coordination among the flotilla's various small vessels that the force had rehearsed extensively in the weeks before the raid, since any significant navigational error on the approach risked scattering the force, delaying the timed arrival that synchronized Campbelltown's ramming run with the tidal conditions the plan depended on, or alerting German coastal defenses prematurely before the flotilla had closed to a range where the raid still stood a reasonable chance of success, only once the force had closed to within a few hundred yards of the dock itself, and German suspicion had finally hardened into certainty, did Campbelltown strike her German colours and run up the white ensign in their place, a deliberate, almost ceremonial gesture rooted in the Royal Navy's long-standing convention that no ship should go into action flying anything other than her own true colours, even in the final minutes of a raid that depended entirely on deception to reach its objective at all. This moment marked the effective end of the deception phase and the beginning of a purely violent, close-range action as German gun crews, no longer uncertain about what they were facing, opened fire with everything within range. The moment the deception collapsed, Saint-Nazaire's harbour defences opened fire with everything available: coastal artillery batteries, flak guns repurposed for direct fire against surface targets, and machine guns positioned along the dock's perimeter and surrounding buildings, throwing a volume of fire at the approaching flotilla that tore through the wooden hulls of the motor launches with devastating effect, several of them bursting into flame or sinking outright before they could even land their commando parties at the secondary targets they had been assigned. The motor launches, built primarily of wood and carrying fuel tanks that made them especially vulnerable to incendiary and tracer fire, suffered disproportionately during this phase of the action compared to Campbelltown herself, whose steel hull and added armor plating gave her crew considerably better protection against the same weight of fire, even as she pressed on toward her ramming point. Campbelltown herself, armored around her critical stations and driven forward by Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beattie, with total commitment, despite the storm of fire raking her decks and superstructure, held her course, working up to nearly her full speed of 19 knots in the final approach, crossing the very shoal water that conventional naval planners had considered impassable for a vessel of her size, timed deliberately to coincide with a period of unusually high spring tide that gave her just enough clearance over the sandbanks to make the run at all. As 0134 hours on March 28, 1942, Campbelltown struck the Normandie Dock's outer casing gate almost precisely as planned, her reinforced bow driving several meters into the structure and lodging there, the impact bringing her forward momentum to a violent stop, while her stern continued to grind and settle into position. The ship, now embedded in the very structure combined operations had sent her 400 miles to destroy. The precision of this impact mattered enormously to the raid's eventual success. Had Campbelltown struck the gate at an angle, or failed to achieve sufficient penetration into the structure, the subsequent explosion, however powerful, might have failed to inflict the specific kind of structural damage the mission required. Beattie's navigation and ship handling through the final, heavily contested approach, conducted under continuous and increasingly accurate fire, ensured that the ship struck close enough to the intended point and angle to make the charge's eventual detonation maximally effective against the gate structure itself. What followed was not the end of the raid, but its second, in many ways more costly phase. Commando parties, having survived the run-in aboard the motor launches that had made it through the harbour defences fire, disembarked under continuing heavy resistance to attack their assigned secondary targets throughout the dock complex, demolition teams moving to destroy the pumping machinery and winding gear that controlled the dock's water levels, the U-boat pen installations, and other port infrastructure, working with satchel charges and explosive demolition equipment under sustained German fire from positions the raid's planners had known about in advance, but could never fully suppress with the limited force available. These secondary demolition tasks, though overshadowed in most popular accounts by the dramatic image of Campbelltown's ramming run and subsequent explosion, represented a substantial and carefully planned component of the overall operation in their own right, aimed at ensuring that even the dock supporting machinery, the pumps, valves, and winding gear necessary to actually operate the facility as a functioning dry dock, sustained damage severe enough that even a successfully repaired casing gate would not restore the dock to full operational capability without considerable additional reconstruction work. The fighting through the dock complex over the following hours was close, brutal, and increasingly desperate as German reinforcements, alerted by the sound of the initial engagement, converged on the harbour area in growing numbers, while the commando force, working to a strict and rapidly collapsing timetable, attempted to complete their demolition tasks and then withdraw to the motor launches for evacuation back down the Loire and out to open water, where a group of escorting destroyers waited to collect the returning force for the transit home. That withdrawal, in practice, largely failed. Of the motor launches that had survived the run-in intact enough to attempt an evacuation, the great majority were destroyed or disabled by German fire during the attempted withdrawal down the narrow, heavily defended estuary, and of the roughly 611 men who had sailed on Operation Chariot, only about 228 made it back to Britain by sea. A further small number eventually escaped overland through occupied and then unoccupied France, reaching neutral Spain and eventually Britain months later. But the substantial majority of the raiding force was either killed in the fighting around the dock and the failed evacuation, or captured and taken into German custody as prisoners of war once ammunition, and in many cases entire units, were exhausted. Stephen Beattie, having brought Campbelltown to her ramming point and completed the mission's most technically demanding single task, was among those captured after the ship's crew, their vessel now erect and grounded hulk-lodged in the casing gate, fought on with small arms until further resistance became impossible, and Beattie spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner. Charles Newman, having led the commando force ashore and coordinated the demolition raids against the dock's secondary targets even as the evacuation collapsed around him, was likewise captured attempting to fight his way clear of the harbour area with a small party of survivors once it became clear that no further evacuation by sea remained possible. Commander Robert Ryder, aboard MGB 314, succeeded in extracting himself and a portion of the naval force back to open water and eventual rescue by the waiting destroyers, one of a comparatively small number of the raid's senior commanders, to return to Britain immediately rather than as a prisoner or an escaper months later. The human cost of Operation Chariot, measured against its stated objective, was severe by any standard. Roughly 2/3 of the entire raiding force killed, captured, or missing in a single night's action against a single target, a casualty rate that in almost any other context would have marked the operation as an outright disaster regardless of whatever damage had actually been inflicted on the dock itself. The charge packed into Campbelltown's boat detonated at approximately noon on March 28, roughly 10.5 hours after the ramming, at a point in the day when the immediate crisis appeared, from the German perspective, to have entirely passed. German naval and military personnel, along with, according to several post-war accounts, a number of curious French civilian officials and dockyard workers who had been permitted or had simply gathered to view the wrecked British destroyer sitting embedded in their own dry docks gate, had spent the intervening hours inspecting the grounded hull, entirely unaware of the concrete encased charge sitting directly beneath and around them, or apparently unconcerned enough by whatever searches had already been conducted to have concluded any danger had passed. Accounts collected after the war describe German officers touring the wreck, some reportedly speculating openly about what possible military purpose such an old and apparently lightly armed destroyer could have served in ramming the gate at all, entirely unaware that the answer to their own question sat encased in concrete directly beneath their feet, its chemical fuses running down toward detonation with no external sign of the danger at all. The explosion, when the delay fuses finally reached their set point, was catastrophic and immediate. The Normandie Dock's outer casing gate, the very structure the charge had been positioned against and around with such deliberate precision, was destroyed outright, its structural integrity broken beyond any possibility of straightforward repair. German casualties from the blast itself have been estimated by post-war historians at somewhere in the range of 360 killed, the great majority of them German military and naval personnel who had gathered aboard or immediately around the wrecked destroyer specifically to inspect her in the hours following the raid's apparent conclusion, an outcome the delay fuses timing had been deliberately engineered to produce. This single delayed detonation, in terms of German personnel killed in an instant, exceeded the combined toll of the entire preceding night's fighting throughout the dock complex, a grim illustration of how completely the raid's planners had succeeded in weaponizing German confidence that the danger had already passed. The Normandie Dock remained completely unusable for the remainder of the Second World War. German engineers, faced with the casing gate destroyed beyond field repair and the dock chamber, whose water control machinery had, in many cases, also been successfully sabotaged by the commando demolition teams during the raid's second phase, concluded that full restoration of the dock's function would require a scale of engineering resources and time that the ongoing war effort could not justify diverting to a single facility, particularly given that the strategic circumstances that had made the dock valuable in the first place, the presence of German capital ships actively raiding the Atlantic and requiring exactly this kind of large-capacity repair facility on the French coast, had themselves changed considerably by the time any full restoration have been contemplated. The dock was not returned to operational service until well after the war's end, a downtime stretching across more than 5 years from the night of the raid, meaning that from March 28, 1942, onward, no German capital ship damaged in Atlantic operations had any large dry dock facility available anywhere on the French coast, and any ship requiring that scale of repair faced the considerably longer and more dangerous alternative of returning either to occupied Norwegian waters or all the way back to Germany itself, a transit that meant running the gauntlet of exactly the kind of British naval and air patrols that had already come close to destroying Bismarck on her own attempted run toward the very dock Campbelltown had just eliminated. The 5 Victoria Crosses awarded for actions during Operation Chariot, the largest number given for a single raid in the entire history of the decoration, reflected both the extraordinary individual courage displayed throughout the operation and the extent to which the raid's planners and participants alike understood, from the outset, that they were being asked to accept odds that offered no realistic prospect of a clean, low-cost success. Stephen Beattie received the Victoria Cross for bringing Campbelltown to a ramming point against sustained and heavy fire, a citation that specifically credited the near impossibility of the navigational and tactical challenge he had been set and the composure with which he executed it regardless. Charles Newman's Victoria Cross recognized his leadership of the commando force ashore, continuing to direct and coordinate the demolition raids against the dock's secondary targets, even as the situation around him deteriorated into a fighting withdrawal he knew had little realistic prospect of full success. Robert Ryder's award recognized his overall command of the naval force and his personal conduct throughout the approach and subsequent withdrawal under fire. Able seaman William Savage, a gunner aboard one of the small motor gunboats, received a posthumous Victoria Cross for continuing to man his exposed gun position and engage German shore defences even as his own vessel came under devastating and ultimately fatal fire. A citation awarded specifically to recognise the wider gallantry of the many gunboat and motor launch crews who had fought and, in many cases, died covering the raid's main effort under conditions the official citation described in language stripped of embellishment. Sergeant Thomas Durant, an Army Royal Engineers demolition specialist serving as a machine gunner aboard one of the motor launches during the attempted withdrawal, continued to man his weapon and engage pursuing German vessels, despite being repeatedly wounded, ultimately dying of his wounds after his launch was overwhelmed, becoming, in a detail naval historians have noted as genuinely unusual, the only member of the British Army ever awarded the Victoria Cross specifically for an action fought entirely at sea, a recognition that reflected how thoroughly the boundaries between naval and land combat had dissolved in the close, desperate fighting of the raid's final hours. The strategic consequences of Operation Chariot extended well beyond the immediate destruction of a single dock gate, though that destruction alone had achieved precisely the objective combined operations planners had set out to accomplish. German Naval Command, already deeply cautious about risking capital ships after the loss of Bismarck the previous year, now faced a strategic landscape in which Tirpitz'S, the one heavy unit still capable of threatening the Arctic convoy routes, had no viable large-scale repair facility available anywhere on the French Atlantic coast should she ever attempt the kind of extended Atlantic sortie Bismarck had undertaken, a consideration that reinforced rather than created German naval command's already cautious posture, but that removed one of the few remaining strategic options that might otherwise have tempted a more aggressive commander to risk exactly the kind of breakout the Royal Navy had spent the entirety of 1941 and 1940 to organising its heavy units specifically to prevent. Tirpitz herself never attempted an Atlantic breakout of the kind Bismarck had, remaining based in Norwegian waters for the entirety of her operational career, a decision shaped by a combination of factors extending well beyond the loss of the Normandie Dock alone, but one to which the dock's destruction unambiguously contributed, removing a strategic option that German naval planning could otherwise have factored into any future decision to risk the fleet's last remaining capital ship in Atlantic waters. Instead, Tirpitz spent most of her remaining career as what naval historians have often termed a fleeting being, a ship whose mere continued existence in Norwegian waters tied down a disproportionate share of British naval resources dedicated to watching and containing her, without the ship herself ever needing to fire a shot in a major fleet action to justify that ongoing commitment of Allied attention and force. When Tirpitz was eventually crippled and, later, entirely destroyed, first by the Meade submarine attack of September 1943 and finally by RAF Bomber Command's Torboy raids in the autumn of 1944, she met that fate still confined to the waters where the Royal Navy in combined operations had worked. Across a whole series of separate and individually costly operations to keep her permanently contained, Winston Churchill, in the aftermath of the raid, described Operation Chariot as one of the most audacious actions ever carried out by any force, and post-war naval historians on both the British and German sides have generally judged it, whatever the severity of its human cost, to have achieved its stated strategic objective more completely and more permanently than the raid's own planners had necessarily dared to hope in advance. The dock the raid destroyed was not repaired for the remainder of the war it had been fought in, and the specific strategic scenario the raid had been designed to prevent, a German capital ship using Saint-Nazaire as a forward Atlantic repair base after breaking out to raid convoy shipping, never occurred at any point across the remaining 3 years of the war in Europe. A negative result, the absence of a threat that never materialized, That is inherently harder to measure than a sunk ship or a captured position, but that German naval planning records examined after the war confirmed had genuinely factored into Kriegsmarine thinking about the risks of any future Atlantic sortie by Tirpitz'S or any other heavy unit. The raid's legacy within the broader history of combined operations extended beyond Saint-Nazaire itself, informing the planning and doctrine that would eventually shape far larger amphibious operations later in the war. The lessons drawn from Operation Chariot about the value of deception in achieving tactical surprise against a heavily defended coastal target, about the importance of precise timing coordinated against tidal conditions, and about the genuine strategic value that a single, carefully targeted raid against critical infrastructure could achieve when a conventional military solution was unavailable or prohibitively costly, fed into the planning processes that combined operations and, later, the planners of the Normandy invasion itself would draw upon as the war progressed toward its eventual large-scale amphibious operations against occupied Europe. The raid also served, in the more immediate term, as a significant morale boost for a British public that had spent much of 1941 and early 1942 absorbing a steady diet of difficult news from multiple theatres of the war, offering a clear, unambiguous story of British daring and success at a moment when such stories remained relatively rare. The ship that made the raid possible in its most literal, physical sense had never been built for anything remotely resembling this mission, and that fact sits at the centre of what Operation Chariot ultimately demonstrated about the actual military value of an asset the country that built her had already judged obsolete enough to trade away entirely. USS Buchanan had been laid down in 1918, one of well over 200 nearly identical destroyers rushed into mass production in the closing months of the First World War, a design whose limitations were well understood by the United States Navy itself to decades later, so poorly regarded by 1940 standards that 50 of her sister ships were judged worth exchanging, in their entirety, for nothing more than the right to establish American bases on British territory, a trade that reflected a considered American naval judgment that these ships offered more value as a bargaining chip than as continued frontline combatants in anyone's Navy. 2 years later, one of those 50 supposedly obsolete destroyers, modified with nothing more sophisticated than removed weight, altered funnels, semi-improvised armor plating, and several tons of concrete-encased explosive packed into her bow, destroyed the only dry dock on the entire French Atlantic coast capable of servicing the most powerful battleship in the German fleet, killed more German military personnel and a single delayed explosion than many considerably larger naval engagements of the war managed to inflict, and denied the Kriegsmarine's most dangerous remaining capital ship a strategic option that meaningfully shaped how cautiously that ship was employed for the entire remainder of her operational life. HMS Campbelltown was never expected to survive the mission that made her useful, and by design, she never did. Her wrecked and grounded hull effectively destroyed the moment she struck the casing gate she had been sent to ram. What the United States Navy had judged, in 1940, to be worth trading away for a handful of overseas bases turned out, in the hands of planners willing to build an entire mission around exactly what an aging, expendable hull could still accomplish that a modern, valuable warship never could have been risked to attempt, to be worth considerably more than the scrapyard value her own original owners had assigned her. In the end, it was not her guns, her speed, or her modern equipment that made Campbelltown decisive, but the very obsolescence that had once marked her for disposal, an asset with nothing left to lose, sent on a mission built entirely around that single, unrepeatable fact.